short-legged horse rejected at auction. Humble young man buys it. What happens next will amaze you. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty fairgrounds. It was the day of the annual Great Plains Horse Race, a prestigious event that drew the best riders and their horses from miles around. Spectators lined the edges of the track, their excitement palpable in the warm, dry air. The distant sound of children laughing, the chatter of excited adults, and the occasional clink of horses' hooves striking the ground filled the atmosphere. The race was the highlight of the fair, an event that everyone waited for, year after year. Among the crowd, most eyes were on the familiar faces, the wealthy landowners, seasoned riders, and horses that had become legends in their own right. These horses were tall, muscular, and fast, bred specifically for competition. The crowd cheered for the likes of Caden and his horse, Thunderstrike, a beast of a stallion with hooves like thunder and a reputation for tearing through every race he entered. Caden himself was the image of confidence. His leather jacket, adorned with gold trim, gleamed under the sun, and his posture was that of a man who knew victory was inevitable. But there was another rider at the starting line, one whose presence was far less celebrated. Ethan, a young man in his late teens, stood beside his horse, Stormcloud. Where Caden and Thunderstrike were powerful and imposing, Ethan and Stormcloud were the exact opposite. Stormcloud was a smaller horse, not built for speed but for endurance. His coat, a pale gray with dark streaks running through it, glistened in the afternoon sun, but his legs were short, his gait a little awkward, and his body not nearly as muscular as the other competitors. Ethan, however, didn't seem to mind. His gaze was fixed on the track ahead, his hands gently stroking Stormcloud's neck, murmuring soft words of encouragement. He knew this race wouldn't be easy. He knew that no one was expecting him to win. But that didn't matter. He and Stormcloud had been through too much together for him to back down now. As he looked around, Ethan noticed the glances that others shot his way. Smirks, whispers, and snickers. Some riders even pointed at him, shaking their heads, as if they couldn't fathom why he was here. It was clear they considered him nothing more than an afterthought. Ethan was the underdog and no one gave him a chance. His horse was too small, too slow. He was just a boy with a dream, surrounded by men who had the wealth, the horses, and the experience to dominate. Ethan's father had passed away the year before, leaving him with little more than a small, modest farm to manage. It hadn't been easy, but Ethan had always believed in Stormcloud. The horse had been with him since he was a boy, and together, they had faced countless challenges. Stormcloud had never been the fastest, but there was a quiet strength in him, an unwavering will to keep going, no matter how tough things got. It was that spirit that had kept Ethan going, long after others had doubted him. But today wasn't just about racing. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or showing off his abilities. It was about something deeper. Ethan had heard rumors, whispers in town, about corruption and dishonesty behind the scenes at the Great Plains Horse Race. People talked about how the race wasn't always won by the fastest horse, but by those with the right connections, the right amount of money, or the right influence. Ethan didn't want to believe it, but as he looked at the smug faces of the other riders, especially Caden, who was already acting as though victory was guaranteed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, Ethan refused to be intimidated. He mounted Stormcloud and tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes hardening with determination. "We've got this, boy," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "We may not be the biggest or the fastest, but we have something better, Hart." The announcer's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, signaling the start of the race. The horses shuffled nervously in their positions as the riders adjusted their saddles and steadied their grips. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The ground beneath him felt solid, but there was a tightness in his chest, a reminder of just how much was on the line. When the starting gun fired, the ground trembled with the force of hooves thundering down the track. Stormcloud lurched forward, and Ethan urged him on, the wind whipping past his face. But from the first stride, it was clear that Stormcloud wasn't going to be able to keep up. The larger horses surged ahead, their riders shouting commands, pushing their steeds into a breakneck pace. Ethan could only watch as the gap widened between him and the front runners. But Ethan didn't flinch. His mind was focused, not on the race in front of him, but on his horse and their journey together. He whispered softly to Stormcloud, urging him to keep going. "We may not be fast, but we're not quitting," he said. It was a promise not just to Stormcloud but to himself. He wasn't here to win. He was here to show the world that the greatest strength came not from speed or size, but from heart and perseverance. As the other riders disappeared ahead, leaving him and Stormcloud in the dust, Ethan's resolve only deepened. Today would be a test of endurance, of courage, and of trust. The race had begun, and for Ethan and Stormcloud, this was their moment to prove that even the underdog could leave a mark. The loud blast of the starting gun echoed across the fairgrounds, signaling the beginning of the most anticipated event of the year. The once still air seemed to vibrate with the power of the race, and the horses, eager for the challenge ahead, tensed in their stalls. The track, a dusty ribbon winding through the sprawling fairgrounds, was already shrouded in a cloud of dust as the massive crowd cheered with excitement. A sea of faces waved banners, clapped, and shouted their support. But in the midst of the crowd, Ethan felt like a single grain of sand in an endless desert. As the horses surged forward, the earth seemed to shake beneath their hooves. Ethan and Stormcloud were swallowed by the dust, the thundering hooves of the other competitors overwhelming the stillness of the moment. Caden, mounted atop his colossal stallion Thunderstrike, immediately surged to the front, his horse's power almost palpable as they tore down the track. The crowd's cheers grew louder as the race unfolded with breathtaking speed, but Ethan's gaze never left the back of Caden's stallion. Ethan could feel the weight of all the eyes on him, could feel the doubt and disbelief that poured from the crowd. He could hear the mutters and see the disapproving looks. They didn't think he had a chance. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. But none of that mattered to him. Stormcloud was not the strongest, not the fastest, and certainly not the tallest. But what they had, was a bond forged over years of companionship, of quiet mornings spent together on the farm, of shared victories and losses. It was a connection that went beyond training, beyond competition. It was a shared understanding, a silent communication that passed between horse and rider, heart and spirit. "Come on, boy," Ethan whispered, urging Stormcloud forward. The horse's hooves pounded heavily on the ground, the rhythmic thumping echoing in Ethan's chest like a beating heart. The horse's legs, though shorter than those of the larger steeds, moved steadily, determined to keep up. The dust rose in clouds as they pushed forward, but it quickly became apparent that this race was not going to be easy for them. The other horses were already far ahead, the powerful stallions effortlessly gliding across the track as though the race was little more than a casual stroll. Caden was in the lead, of course, riding with the confidence of someone who already believed the victory was his. His smug smile could be seen even from a distance as he looked back over his shoulder, undoubtedly enjoying the view of his competitors falling further behind. Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew he wasn't going to be able to match their speed. But that wasn't the point. He wasn't here to win in the traditional sense. In the distance, Caden's Thunderstrike was already ahead, taking the first bend effortlessly, while Stormcloud struggled to maintain a steady pace. Ethan felt the familiar rush of adrenaline in his veins as they rounded the first turn, the curve of the track sending a sharp gust of wind across his face. He leaned forward, urging Stormcloud to keep going, to push past the doubts that had already begun to creep into his mind. The horse's legs strained, and Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a steady rhythm to match the beat of the hooves. "We're not done yet, buddy," Ethan murmured. The first stretch was brutal. Stormcloud was already falling behind, his smaller, stockier build no match for the speed of the thoroughbreds. As Caden and the others rocketed down the track, the gap between them and Ethan widened, and Ethan's stomach churned with frustration. He could feel the sting of every mocking glance from the crowd, every whisper of disbelief. But none of that was important. He focused on the horse beneath him, focusing all his attention on the rhythm of Stormcloud's breathing, on the steady rise and fall of his chest. He felt every shift, every tremor, and every heartbeat. They weren't out of this race yet. The track stretched out before them, a long, winding path that seemed to disappear into the horizon. The cheers of the crowd were a distant echo, and all that remained in Ethan's mind was the sound of storm clouds' hooves pounding the dirt, the sound of their unity and determination. As the other riders pushed their horses further ahead, Ethan leaned closer to Stormcloud, his hands tightly gripping the reins. "Come on, Stormcloud. You've got this." Despite their disadvantage, Stormcloud kept moving forward, never once slowing down. It was a slow race, but it was a race of heart. As they rounded another bend, Ethan noticed that something strange was happening. The other horses, though still far ahead, seemed to be having difficulty keeping their pace. Some were beginning to stumble, their strides faltering, as though something was interfering with their movements. At first, Ethan thought it was a coincidence, but then he noticed that the dust in the air seemed to shift unnaturally, swirling in odd patterns, moving almost as if it were alive. His stomach twisted with unease. Something wasn't right. He glanced around quickly, trying to figure out what was happening, but the other riders were too focused on their own progress to notice the oddity. As Caden's towering thunderstrike began to slow slightly, Ethan's suspicions grew. Stormcloud pressed on, though his smaller form struggled against the overwhelming odds. But as they continued through the race, Ethan began to see what no one else had yet noticed. Caden, the man who had confidently led the charge, was not immune to the effects of the strange dust. The horse began to falter, stumbling in a way that made Ethan's heart race with renewed hope. Maybe they weren't the only ones affected by this strange, unseen force. Maybe Stormcloud still had a chance. "Hold on, buddy," Ethan muttered, tightening his grip on the reins. His determination surged as he urged Stormcloud forward, willing his horse to push through the exhaustion and strain. In this race, it wasn't just about speed or power. It wasn't just about beating the odds with raw strength. It was about resilience, about pushing through the storm no matter how hard the world tried to hold you back. And as Ethan watched the other competitors stumble and falter, his heart swelled with renewed confidence. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. The race had been raging for what felt like an eternity, but Ethan's eyes never wavered from the track ahead. The strange dust swirling in the air had intensified, almost as if it had become a living thing, choking the air and clouding his vision. Stormcloud was struggling, but his pace had become more determined with each step, as though the horse could sense the growing tension in the air. There was something unsettling happening behind the scenes, and Ethan could feel it deep in his gut. As the race continued, a few riders began to fall back, struggling with their horses in ways that made no sense. At first, Ethan thought it might be the heat, the fatigue of the race catching up with them, but then it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. One by one, competitors began to struggle. The once pristine stallions, whose speed had been effortless at the beginning, now stumbled, their strides growing uneven as though they had been drugged, their powerful legs shaking beneath them. Caden, ever the competitor, had been in the lead for much of the race, but now his thunderstrike seemed to falter. The massive stallion, once a blur of power, was slowing down, his once strong legs giving way as his breathing became labored. Caden's face, full of confidence only moments before, now twisted with frustration and confusion. The crowd had begun to notice too, and their gasps of disbelief filled the air. Ethan's heart raced. Something was wrong. He pushed Stormcloud harder, feeling the pressure building, not just in his own body but in the atmosphere around him. The heat, the tension, and the strange dust clung to everything, obscuring their vision. But that wasn't the worst part. As they rounded a bend, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. Caden, still in the lead, suddenly yanked hard on the reins of Thunderstrike, pulling the horse off the track and into the infield. Ethan could hear him shouting to his team, his words muffled by the roaring in his ears, but there was no mistaking what was happening. Caden's face twisted in anger, frustration, and fear. Then, as if in slow motion, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. A figure standing near the track, half hidden behind a row of barrels. The figure was moving swiftly, almost too quickly to be seen, but Ethan caught just enough of a glimpse to recognize the shadowy outline of a person tampering with something at the side of the course. A glint of metal caught the sunlight, followed by the unmistakable sound of a small device clicking into place. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sabotage wasn't just in the horses, it was on the track itself. Before he could react, a loud crash echoed through the air. Thunderstrike, the massive stallion, had collapsed onto the track. Caden barely had time to jump off as the horse bucked and twisted, its legs trembling as though it had lost control of its own movements. The other horses, too, were showing signs of distress. The heat and confusion, coupled with the strange, invisible force at work, were wreaking havoc on them. Ethan knew now that the sabotage wasn't random. It was calculated. Someone had deliberately tampered with the race, and the mysterious figure on the sidelines had to be the culprit. The realization hit Ethan like a wave crashing against the shore. Someone had deliberately caused the horses to struggle, and they were paying the price for it. But it wasn't just about sabotage, it was about the people behind it. He had no proof, no solid evidence yet, but he had seen enough to know that this race wasn't about to end on someone else's terms. He wouldn't let it. Not after all they had been through, not after everything Stormcloud had overcome. Caden was furious, his face red with anger as he tried to get Thunderstrike back on his feet. But the horse was too weak to continue. The damage was done. Ethan knew it wasn't just bad luck or an unfortunate turn of events. It was sabotage, and it was targeted. As the race continued, the chaos on the track grew. Stormcloud, still moving steadily, was beginning to take advantage of the faltering horses. Ethan could feel the stirrings of hope rising within him, but the anger in his chest only burned brighter. He glanced back at Caden, who was now being assisted by his team, but it was too late for them. Ethan knew the real race was just beginning. Suddenly, a voice shouted from the sidelines. It was barely audible over the noise, but Ethan could hear the unmistakable words. "Cheaters! Saboteurs!" The crowd gasped, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, but the words, they were a warning. Caden's team had been caught, and the sabotage was out in the open. The onlookers, once filled with excitement, now turned to stunned silence, their eyes darting between the chaotic scene on the track and the mysterious figure who had been seen near the barrels. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed Stormcloud forward, determined to finish the race and expose the truth. He could see the figure moving quickly now, disappearing into the crowd, but he was too far behind to catch them in time. There was a chance, just a small chance, that this was his moment, the one opportunity to show the world that he and Stormcloud were not just participants in the race, but the true competitors, the ones who could overcome anything, even sabotage. With every ounce of strength, Ethan urged Stormcloud forward, his body moving in perfect synchrony with the horse. The finish line was in sight, and though the race had been marred by chaos, the final stretch was his. As the pair of them surged forward, Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about winning anymore. This was about redemption. This was about proving that no matter how hard someone tried to break him down, he would always rise again. And with one final burst of speed, Stormcloud crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted into stunned silence. Caden, still fuming, had long since dropped out of the race, his horse lying on the track in a heap. But Ethan didn't look back at him. His focus remained forward, determined to expose the truth. The sabotage had been revealed, but the race wasn't over yet. The truth had to come out, and Ethan wasn't about to let anyone walk away without facing the consequences. He had come too far to let it all fall apart now. As the dust from the race settled, an eerie stillness took over the track. The crowd, once filled with anticipation, now murmured in hushed tones, their eyes flickering between the chaos and the man who had just crossed the finish line, victorious yet somehow different. Ethan and Stormcloud stood still in the aftermath, their breathing heavy, their bodies exhausted, but their resolve unwavering. It was a moment that transcended the finish line. Their resilience had been tested, not just by the race itself, but by everything that had led them here. The sabotage had cast a long shadow over the event, and while many people were still grappling with the implications of what had happened, Ethan and Stormcloud were already looking ahead. It was as if, in that brief moment when they had crossed the line, everything that had been stacked against them no longer mattered. The obstacles, the manipulation, the odds, none of it could break their spirit. Ethan's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of emotions that coursed through him. He had been through so much with Stormcloud, and yet this felt different. It was more than just a race. It was a testament to their journey together. He looked over at his horse, and there it was, Stormcloud's wide eyes, glistening with determination and strength, reflecting the bond they had formed. It wasn't just about speed or endurance. It was about trust, the unwavering trust between them, the belief that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. But it wasn't just the physical strain that had tested them. Stormcloud, like Ethan, had fought through pain and doubt. This horse had come from nothing, once a misfit with little promise, but over time, he had transformed into something far greater. The doubts others had about him, the whispers of inadequacy, had all been shattered by his resilience. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now they were standing in the aftermath, not as victims of sabotage, but as champions of their own will. Ethan's thoughts flashed back to the early days with Stormcloud. The horse had been different then, weak, uncoordinated, and slow. But Ethan had seen something in him. He saw potential. He knew that behind those uncertain eyes was a spirit that refused to give up, no matter how many times the world tried to tear them apart. And that resilience was exactly what they needed now. As the crowds began to disperse, whispering about the scandal, Ethan refused to let the shadow of the sabotage cloud their moment. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let the actions of one cowardly person define everything he and Stormcloud had accomplished. His heart swelled with pride as he looked at his horse, still standing tall, even in the face of adversity. This wasn't just a victory over others. This was a victory over the forces that had sought to keep them down. A few reporters approached, their cameras flashing and microphones held out, eager to hear Ethan's thoughts. He knew what they expected, his victory speech, his moment of triumph. But he couldn't bring himself to focus on anything other than Stormcloud. He could have easily used this moment to gloat, to bask in the victory, but that wasn't the story. The real story was the bond between them, the relentless, unwavering trust that had carried them through everything. As one reporter asked, "Ethan, what do you think about the sabotage that occurred during the race?" He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing slightly. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't even about the race, it was about something deeper. He answered simply, "This isn't just about a race. It's about what we overcome to get here. And no one can take that away from us." The reporters exchanged glances, sensing the sincerity in his words. But Ethan knew that even if the world didn't fully understand the weight of his words, he didn't need them to. He had Stormcloud, his partner, his champion, his friend. The crowd, now dissipating, had seen the results of the race. They had seen Stormcloud and Ethan cross the line, and while some were still reeling from the chaos and scandal, the truth had already begun to surface. Caden and his team would face the consequences for their actions. The corruption would be rooted out. But for now, Ethan and Stormcloud had something far more important. They had each other, and they had proven to the world that resilience could never be silenced. As they made their way off the track, the weight of the day's events began to sink in. The adrenaline of the race was fading, but the connection between them was stronger than ever. Stormcloud nudged Ethan gently with his nose, a quiet gesture of affection that spoke volumes. Ethan smiled and stroked the horse's mane, his fingers brushing through the thick coat. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to feel proud. Not of the victory, but of the journey, of how far they had come together against all odds. This was their moment, one that would stay with them forever. Ethan and Stormcloud's resilience had not only defined the race, but had also shaped their legacy, proving that the strength of the human spirit and the bond with a loyal companion could never be broken. The world might not always be kind, but together, Ethan and Stormcloud had learned that nothing could stop them, not even sabotage. And as they walked off the track, side by side, the future seemed brighter than ever. The final stretch of the race was nothing short of breathtaking. As the horses thundered around the final turn, Ethan could feel the weight of the day pressing against him. His muscles ached, his body drenched in sweat, but his heart was as steadfast as ever. He glanced over at Stormcloud, who, despite everything they had already endured, was still pushing forward. The horse's eyes, wide with determination, reflected an unwavering spirit. This was the moment they had been working toward, the moment that would define them both. With every stride, the gap between them and the leaders seemed to grow, but Ethan refused to let despair take hold. It didn't matter how far behind they were. What mattered was that they were still in the race. They had made it this far together, and that in itself was an achievement. In a world where speed and power often define success, Ethan knew that their true victory would come from their relentless determination to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against them. As Stormcloud's hoofs pounded the dirt track, Ethan's mind raced back to the days when they first started training. The horse had been small, timid, and sickly, a far cry from the strong and determined animal beneath him now. They had faced countless setbacks, illness, injury, and the constant whispers that Stormcloud would never be enough. Yet, with every challenge, they had pushed forward. Together, they had fought for a future, for a dream that so many others had dismissed as impossible. And now that dream was within reach. They passed the final curve, the finish line in sight. Ethan's eyes narrowed with focus. He could feel the crowd's eyes on them, but it didn't matter. What mattered now was what he and Stormcloud had built together. The bond between them, the shared belief in each other's strength. They were fighting for more than just a win. They were fighting to prove that nothing, no sabotage, no obstacles, could take away their spirit. Their victory was already written in the very steps they had taken to get here. Ahead of them, the other riders, their horses now showing signs of fatigue, were slowing. The dust in the air had taken its toll, and the once dominant steeds were beginning to falter. For the first time in the race, Stormcloud was starting to find his rhythm, his pace steady and sure. Ethan could feel the strength returning to his horse, the bond between them fueling Stormcloud's every move. He leaned forward, whispering words of encouragement as they neared the final stretch. "You've got this, buddy," he muttered, his voice rough with emotion. "We're almost there." The final stretch was a blur of movement, the finish line creeping closer with every moment. But it wasn't just the line that mattered anymore. It was the journey to get there. The struggles they had endured, the hardships they had faced, all led them to this point. And in that instant, everything else faded away. All that was left was Ethan, Stormcloud, and the shared drive to finish what they had started. As they neared the final 100 yards, Stormcloud surged forward, his hooves digging into the track with a renewed intensity. Ethan's heart raced, not from fear, but from sheer adrenaline. His hand gripped the reins tightly, urging his horse on with every ounce of energy he had left. He knew they didn't have to win to prove their worth. They had already done that. But the finish line was within reach, and Stormcloud was giving everything he had. They were closing the gap. The other riders, once so far ahead, were now within striking distance. The crowd's cheers swelled, their voices rising with the excitement of the race's final moments. And through it all, Ethan stayed focused on one thing: Stormcloud's well-being and their unwavering commitment to each other. As they entered the final stretch, the air seemed to thrum with energy. Ethan pushed forward, urging Stormcloud to give just a little more. The horse's muscles strained, but the power of their shared resolve kept them moving forward. It was more than just physical strength, it was a connection, an unspoken understanding that no matter how much they had been pushed, no matter how far behind they would always fight together. And then, with a final burst of effort, Stormcloud surged ahead. The other horses, drained from the sabotage and their own struggles, faltered. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the finish line came closer, closer than he had ever imagined it would. His voice was a fierce whisper as he leaned into Stormcloud, urging the horse one last time. "Come on, buddy. This is our moment." With a final push, they crossed the finish line, perhaps not first, but in a way that mattered far more. They had fought until the very end, overcoming everything that had been thrown at them. The crowd erupted into applause, not for their place in the race, but for their determination. It wasn't the victory they had expected, but it was a victory all the same. They had proven something much more important, that resilience, heart, and courage could win even the toughest of battles. As storm clouds slowed to a trot, Ethan's chest heaved with exhaustion. His body was spent, but his spirit soared. He dismounted carefully, his legs unsteady from the race, but his heart filled with pride. He leaned against Stormcloud, his hand brushing over the horse's damp coat, and whispered in his ear, "We did it." The finish line had come and gone, but what mattered was that they had crossed it together, stronger than ever. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the real victory wasn't in the race itself. It was in the journey. Together, he and Stormcloud had faced the impossible, and together, they had triumphed. As the race came to a close and the crowd cheered, Ethan felt a mix of exhaustion and relief wash over him. But before he could even process it, he saw Caden approaching, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. The smug, arrogant competitor who had tried to sabotage them was now glaring at Ethan with an expression that was far from the cocky confidence he had shown earlier. "You think you're a winner just because you made it to the finish line?" Caden spat, stepping closer. "You're nothing. That horse is nothing. You both should have never even been in this race." Ethan, still catching his breath, stood his ground. He had come so far, through all the hardships, the sabotage, the doubts, and he wasn't about to let Caden undermine everything they had accomplished. The air between them was tense, charged with the weight of the unspoken animosity. "Stormcloud is more than just a horse. We've earned our place here, despite everything you tried to do," Ethan said, his voice steady, but full of quiet defiance. Caden scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You think I care about your little victory? It's just a fluke, Ethan. Stormcloud is weak, and you'll never be anything more than an amateur." Ethan's jaw tightened. This was the moment he could feel it. He had come this far not just for Stormcloud, but for himself. The past wasn't going to define him anymore. "You're wrong," Ethan said firmly. "It's not about winning on the track. It's about proving that no matter what, we keep going. Stormcloud and I, we're not just survivors. We're champions." With that, Ethan turned away, his resolve stronger than ever, knowing that Caden's words no longer had power over him. The race was over, but his journey was just beginning. The days following the race were a blur of emotions for Ethan. The cheers from the crowd still echoed in his mind, but the overwhelming sense of victory was dampened by the harsh realization that Caden's sabotage hadn't gone unnoticed. As much as Ethan had proven to himself and everyone around him that Stormcloud was more than capable, the dark shadow of what had happened in that race weighed heavily on his heart. Though they had finished strong, despite the obstacles, Ethan couldn't shake the knowledge that someone had deliberately tried to undermine their effort. Caden's smug attitude in the aftermath confirmed what Ethan had feared. This wasn't just a race. It was a battle, and Caden had played dirty. The following morning, Ethan made up his mind. He couldn't let this injustice go unchallenged. The idea of letting Caden get away with sabotaging not just his horse but his entire future on the track was unbearable. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who believed in him and Stormcloud, for the underdogs who had no voice when the powerful and wealthy played their dirty games. Caden might have had the money, the influence, but Ethan had something much more important. His heart, his courage, and the unyielding drive to do what was right. He spent the day gathering his thoughts, writing down every detail he could remember from the race. The poisoned water, the strange dust that had affected Stormcloud and the others. He needed proof. But he also knew that one person wouldn't be enough. He needed help, he needed a plan. It wasn't just about confronting Caden anymore. It was about exposing what had happened to everyone, showing that no one should be above the law, no matter how wealthy or powerful they were. Ethan had always been the quiet, reserved type, never one to rock the boat. But this wasn't just about a race. It was about standing up for what was right no matter the cost. He reached out to a few trusted friends in the racing community, people who had known him and Stormcloud for years. He needed witnesses, people who had seen the unusual dust on the track and the way it had affected the horses. With their support, Ethan felt a surge of confidence he hadn't known he was capable of. The next morning, he marched to the fairgrounds to meet with the race organizers, determined to get the truth out. He knew he had to approach them carefully. One wrong move could ruin everything. But he was done being afraid. As he walked through the gates, he found himself thinking back to that moment when Stormcloud had surged forward in the final stretch, when they had both fought through every obstacle to make it to the finish line. He wasn't going to back down now. With the support of his friends and the evidence he had gathered, Ethan made his case to the officials, explaining everything he had witnessed and providing the details about the sabotage. It wasn't just about proving Caden's involvement, but also about uncovering the corruption that could have tainted future races. As Ethan stood before the officials, he couldn't help but think of all the people who had underestimated him and Stormcloud. His journey was far from over, and now, more than ever, he knew that Stormcloud had earned his place in the world, and together, they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. No matter what happened next, Ethan had proven to himself that justice was worth fighting for, and that he would never give up, no matter what stood in his way. As Ethan sat in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation with the race officials, his mind wandered back to the race itself. The chaos, the struggle, and the unwavering determination that had defined him and Stormcloud. Despite the sabotage, despite the odds stacked against them, they had pushed forward. They had proven to everyone watching that true strength was not measured by the speed of a horse or the wealth of its owner, but by the bond shared between a rider and his companion, by the heart and the spirit that refused to back down. Ethan had learned so much throughout this journey. He had started as a young man with a dream, underestimated by many, including Caden. But now, he knew that success wasn't just about winning. It was about resilience, about standing up when life knocked you down, about fighting for what was right even when it seemed impossible. His journey with Stormcloud had taught him that strength came in many forms. Sometimes, it wasn't the physical power that mattered most. It was the strength of character, the unshakable belief that no matter what challenges lay ahead, you could overcome them. Looking back, Ethan realized how far they had come. From the quiet stable where he had first met Stormcloud, to the racetrack where they had fought against all odds, to the moment when he had stood up to Caden and demanded justice. It had all been part of a greater lesson. Life would always throw obstacles in your path. There would always be people trying to bring you down, but it was how you rose that defined you. And with that newfound wisdom, Ethan was more determined than ever. He wasn't just fighting for a win in a race. He was fighting for everything that mattered: integrity, courage, and the belief that anyone, no matter where they started, could rise to greatness. As Ethan stood in the quiet aftermath of his confrontation with the race officials, a wave of emotions swept over him. The road to this point hadn't been easy. He had faced mockery, sabotage, and doubt from all sides. Yet, in the face of adversity, Ethan and Stormcloud had not only survived, they had thrived. Their resilience, the unwavering bond between horse and rider, had carried them through the darkest moments. The journey wasn't just about winning a race. It was about the lessons learned along the way, the importance of standing up for what's right, the power of persistence, and the unbreakable strength of a true partnership. Ethan's story wasn't about conquering the odds in a single race, but about a broader battle for integrity, justice, and courage. In every challenge, Ethan had found a way to rise above the situation, proving that heart and determination were more important than speed or strength. What mattered most was that, despite everything, Ethan had remained true to himself. He hadn't given in to the easy path, the temptation to walk away or give up. He had fought for what was right, and in doing so, he had shown others that even in a world filled with corruption and greed, there was always room for those who refused to compromise their values. His journey was an inspiration to anyone who had ever faced doubt, ridicule, or sabotage. Ethan and Stormcloud had become a beacon of resilience, a reminder that success was not measured by victory alone, but by the courage to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Ethan's journey didn't end with a single race. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where he was no longer just a young rider on a humble horse, but a symbol of hope and perseverance. What had started as a race to prove his worth had transformed into a quest for justice and fairness in the world of competitive racing. With Stormcloud by his side, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. He had faced the hardest of challenges and had emerged stronger for it. His bond with Stormcloud had been tested not just by the trials of the race, but by the very forces trying to tear them apart. But through it all, they had remained unbroken, a testament to the power of trust and resilience. Ethan didn't know what the future would hold, but he was ready to face it with courage. The lessons learned, the friends he had made, and the strength he had discovered within himself would carry him forward, no matter the path. This wasn't just about being the best rider. It was about doing what was right, about making sure that the fight for justice, fairness, and integrity was always worth the effort. As the sun set on that day, Ethan took a deep breath and looked toward the horizon. There were many more races to run, many more challenges to face. But now, he had the confidence to know that, with Stormcloud by his side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. This was only the beginning, and the future was theirs to shape. What an incredible journey Ethan and Stormcloud have been through, right? Their story is a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from resilience, trust, and never giving up, no matter how tough the road ahead may seem. But now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced an obstacle that seemed impossible to overcome, only to find the strength to push through? Or maybe you've had a moment where someone tried to bring you down, but you chose to rise above it? Share your story with us in the comments below. Your experience might just inspire someone else who's going through a tough time right now. And if Ethan and Stormcloud's journey has moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of perseverance, hope, and triumph. We have so many more incredible tales coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Also, share this video with your friends or anyone you think needs a little motivation today. Together, we can spread the message that true strength comes from within, and that, no matter the odds, you can achieve greatness. Thanks for watching, and remember, your journey is just beginning too. Keep fighting, keep believing, and I'll see you in the next video.